All right, so I will present on economic indicators and subjective well-being. So first, this is important to me because I'm interested in solving global problems in politics and economic theories such as capitalism, Marxism, socialism. And it's important to everyone in the broader community because happiness is an issue that affects everyone. Everyone wants to be happy, and currently only 64% of adults are happy according to the Global Happiness Study. Additionally, this is important because we want to shape our economic policy around policies that will make people happier. And there's also a current rhetoric running around about whether it's better for an economy to be necessarily strong in order to encourage happiness, or for an economy to promote equality of opportunity. Now, some key terms here before we begin are subjective well-being. This is a measure of happiness that has variables that have been controlled, such as wars that are in the region, other things that might impact the happiness, so that it can be accurately compared between countries. Additionally, GDP per capita is the average GDP of the country per person within a country. And then income inequality is the differences in income between the richest and the poorest in a country. So to begin with the literature review, one of the seminal contributions to this field was made by Richard Easterling in 1974, where he began to investigate the correlation between happiness and money. And he found that as income rises, happiness and subjective well-being do not increase over time. Now, there have been since this publication several rebuttals to this. Specifically, there have been a lot of researchers working at Berkeley to attempt to disprove this. They provided some evidence to the contrary. They stated there's a positive relationship between income growth and happiness, as well as qualifying this by stating that the relationship may have diminishing returns as income becomes higher past a certain point. They describe somewhat of a U-shaped curve. Finally, income inequality and subjective well-being also has a pretty complex relationship according to the literature. Income inequality can sometimes reduce subjective well-being because it creates, as Wilkinson and Weishi found, it creates social problems such as crime, corruption, poor health, and low trust, which undermines quality of life and reduces subjective well-being. However, others such as Alesina and Senek argue that income inequality increases subjective well-being because it provides incentives for innovation, entrepreneurship, and social mobility that allow people to feel more pride and accomplishment in their actions. Now, due to this, the gap that I identified was that there's a lot of research that compares countries within regions on GDP per capita and income inequality and their relationship to happiness, but there is not a, there's a gap that compares individual countries and the relationships between income inequality and GDP between them, but it's not been looked at a global scale as much. So what I wanted to do was begin to look at this within certain regions and find out what changes there, and then find out how those shift between countries across the world. So due to this, my research question was, compare between regions, which is a better indicator of the subjective well-being of citizens, GDP per capita, or income inequality. So the method that I had from this was that I was going to collect data from publicly available data sets and then do correlations between those. So for subjective well-being, the data set that I chose to use was the World Happiness Index from the World Happiness Report. This utilizes data from the Gallup World Poll on a 0 to 10 scale called the Life Ladder Index. Each country is assigned a value from this index. GDP per capita, I'm using the World Bank, which measures GDP per capita in 2010 US dollars across a large spectrum of time frames. And then for income inequality, I will also use the World Bank's data set here, utilizing the Gini index, which measures income inequality as a Gini coefficient on a scale from 0 to 100, with 0 being a perfectly equal income and 100 being a perfectly unequal income. Now, from this, I wanted to do a Pearson's correlation. There's a few reasons for this. This is a simpler model than many others, and additionally, because subjective well-being already controls for a bunch of other values, there's not as much of a need to do a linear regression model. And I decided that the software that I would use for this would be Google Sheets, because it's free, simple, and effective, and I don't need to do a more complex model or graph it, because making graphs for 84 countries and then trying to display those graphs would be simply unreasonable and not clear for the reader. These Pearson's correlations will be measured in R values, with a 0 being a very low correlation, a 1 being a very high correlation, and a -1 being a very high negative correlation. So my method was that I would sort it based on regions: Southeast Asia, Latin America, West Africa, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe, and then exclude regions that didn't have as much data, such as the Middle East, Southern Africa, Eastern Asia, and Northern North America. And then I would find and discuss trends between these regions and within these regions. So the results that I found, I put these on a map to make it more easy to see. So this is the graph between subjective well-being and GDP per capita and the correlations between them. Countries in blue have a very high positive correlation, and countries in red have a high negative correlation. The darker the country in color, the larger the correlation in their respective ranges. And then this is the graph for the correlation between subjective well-being and income inequality. Again, same scale applied. Now, we can see here on these graphs, as we begin to look at it, we can see that there's a large general trend of positive correlations in GDP. However, this is not completely consistent across the world. Countries in black have no data, and countries in white have no correlation, or a statistically significant correlation. With the Gini index and income inequality's correlation with subjective well-being, we begin to see a more complex relationship begin to arise. It's not as constant across the world. We're seeing, especially in Europe, there's a kind of a large range of different correlations that are appearing within these countries, possibly signifying that different policies within these countries might be affecting the economies and the happiness that are there. However, we begin to see, as we look at East Asia, that there's a more common trend that we can see that as income inequality rises, happiness is decreasing. Now onto the discussion conclusion. So we can see that overall, GDP per capita is more consistent than income inequality. Income inequality tends to range more, but the correlation between GDP per capita and happiness is generally more consistent, but it's not totally consistent regionally. We can see that there's some exceptions here, such as especially India has a very large negative correlation in an area that tends to have a large positive correlation, as well as certain South American countries such as Venezuela. Additionally, income inequality is pretty inconsistent here. We can see that in Europe we have countries such as Germany, which have a high positive correlation, and then right below it, Italy has a large negative correlation. Now, this is in line with what Wilkinson and Pickett, Alesina, and Sinek found, which was that income inequality can have a myriad amount of effects on happiness. I also found that there are some countries that have no correlations and some regions that have no correlations, such as Scandinavia, which tends to have no or very low correlations across both of these values, which is in line with the Easterlin paradox stating that economic trends do not change happiness. Some notable exception countries here, as I mentioned, India has a large negative correlation. This is interesting because it's significant that this is a country that has 15%, 18% of the world's population and is an outlier from the rest of the general world in the GDP per capita correlation, as well as the fact that it also has happiness rising as income inequality is rising, which is an outlier from its region there as well. Additionally, the UK and Netherlands are unique within Europe for the GDP per capita trends, as it can be seen that they both have negative correlations when there's no other country in Europe that has a negative correlation with subjective well-being and GDP per capita. So some implications with this is that neither GDP per capita nor income inequality is necessarily a consistent indicator that can be used to predict the subjective well-being of a country. That utilization of either of these indicators to predict the true outcome of a policy is not going to be massively helpful. We also see a complex relationship that even within regions, by controlling for culture, we are not noticing a large difference, or we're not noticing a large consistency across these. Additionally, some external factors might be affecting these, such as microcultures within certain countries, different populations of minority groups within regions, which might affect the values. And additionally, we can see propaganda might also have to affect if a country is massively utilizing the idea that this country is happy, these policies are working, that might make people feel happier in some areas than countries that might have more democratic governments. Now, some limitations to this is that Africa constitutes 15% of the world, and there's no data on income inequality for this entire region, so I was unable to do correlations for this area. This is problematic because obviously the trends that we see there might change the general view perspective. The Middle East also had no data. Another limitation is the years of available data. Not all countries had data that was going before about 2014, and it would be interesting to look at a larger spectrum of data, and further research should be done on this as data begins to be collected using past archived data from these countries to calculate gene correlations. Finally, correlation does not equal or approximate causation. And it's important to mention here that these correlations do not mean that in Europe, where we can see a large correlation between GDP per capita and happiness, that we should totally prioritize increasing the GDP per capita of these nations, as this does not mean necessarily that happiness will rise. Finally, reference.